Next keynote speaker is Jan Bosch. Jan Bosch is a professor of software engineering and director of the Software Center at the Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, here in Sweden. Earlier, Jan worked as a vice president engineering process at Intuit, where he also led Intuit's open innovation efforts and headed the Central Mobile Technologies team. And before Intuit, we knew Jan as he was working in Finland for Nokia Research Center. Jan is a very well-known author. He has published many influential books. One early book was Design and Use of Software Architectures. Ladies and gentlemen, Jan Bosch.
I think, yes, here we go. We are in business. Let's see if this works. How are you doing? Good morning, everyone. You're having fun yet? Yes, good. Hey, oh, there is a few people in the back that promised to do me a wave. That was amazing. Thank you so much. For the cameraman, I walk a lot, so you'll have to get used to that. I hope you don't get dizzy. I wanted to talk to you about why digitalization will kill your company too. Is that a fine subject? Does that make sense? You all look a little grumpy about that response, but that's where I think we're going with many of the companies that I actually work with. And we are at this really interesting dichotomy, because on the one hand, if we look at life as private persons, life has literally never been better for people, especially in the Western world, but actually worldwide, has never been better for individuals. There has never been a better time in the history of mankind to be alive than today. And there is lots of evidence for it. I mean, if you look at poverty, over the last 30 years, we dropped extreme poverty in the world from 29% to less than 9%. If we look at life expectancy, since 1950, when life expectancy was 47 years, to today, or 2011, it was 70, a 50% improvement in life expectancy for human beings. If we look at war deaths, it's a dramatic drop in the number of people that die through violence in wars. If we look at racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination in the world, there is a 20% decline since 1995 to 2011. So the world really is getting a better place all the time. And you know what? It is us that caused this. Because if you look at the role of digital technology, and digital technology, of course, contains software, the role of digital technology has played an enormous role in the improvement of the state of being for mankind. Anything from mobile phones, internet access, optimization through data, and the connection of devices. We had someone from Ericsson here this morning. Ericsson predicted a few years ago 50 billion connected devices by 2020. I think it's going to be a few years later now, but in any case, all these connections and all the data that gets generated in the world leads to significant improvements for mankind. That's what is happening to humans. And then what is happening to companies? And that's the opposite of what is happening to humans, because if you look at the Fortune 500, the companies that were on the list in the Fortune 500 list in 2000, how many of those were still on the list in 2014? Interestingly enough, more than half of all the companies that were on that list in 2000 are now gone from that list. Yeah, so what we see is that companies are in many ways living shorter and shorter, are successful for shorter and shorter periods. Many companies are one-trick ponies. They're successful in one business, but when society changes, business changes, they stop being successful. Why is this happening? Well, this gentleman, who I think many of you may recognize, Dean Leffingwell, Douglas Engelbart, the inventor of the computer mouse, gives us a hint of what is happening. The digital revolution is far more significant than the invention of writing or even printing. We're in the midst of a completely fundamental change of how society, but also how business is organized. And if we look at the Fortune 500 again, the average tenure, the last research that I could find for a company on the Fortune 500 is now down to 10 years. And the main cause for this is companies fail to innovate and build new core capabilities. And these days, digitalization is the new disruptor. What is digitalization? I just wanted to get the definitions out of the way. This one comes from Gartner. I decided that speaking to an industry forum, I should not come with too many academic definitions. But Gartner says digitalization is the use of digital technologies to change a business model, provide new revenue and value-producing opportunities. It is the process of moving to a digital business. And then if you look at Boston Consulting Group, they basically identify what are the strategic building blocks of a digital transformation. And if you look at those, you can see that, of course, digitally enhanced products, it's adding software to products. But it's not only that, it's also pure software products, it's data-driven services, it's digital services. It's much more than adding software to products that didn't have software in the past. And it's also not just about research and development. It's also about your sales, marketing, and channels. It's about manufacturing. It's about HR and finance. And it's not just about agile transformation or something like that. It's around systems and technology platforms, analytics, and data integration. And it's about your digital partner ecosystem. The danger, and this is the challenging part in this area, is that this touches every individual function in the company, and very often it means that you're actually no longer organized the right way when this wave hits you. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little during the coming hour, because I have 3 key takeaways just for you to tell your friends after this talk. Companies are increasingly disrupted these days, and digitalization is the root cause of this disruption. That's the first thing to remember. The second is, I work with dozens of companies, and I've started to see a number of recurring patterns that drive this enormous resistance to change that I see in many companies. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And then the final point where I will spend roughly half the talk is that I believe that we're moving from the current digital business operating system to the current business operating system to a new digital business operating system. So those are the topics that I was hoping to cover with you this morning. So just to give a quick outline so you have an idea of where you are, I will first tell a little bit about who I am and where I come from, then trends in industry, then I will talk about those patterns of disruption that I've been seeing happening in the companies that I work with, then we'll discuss this new digital business operating system, which in my experience has 4 dimensions. It's about speed, data, ecosystems, and empowerment. And by that time, we go to conclusions. And we're not a super large group, so if you want to stop me and ask any questions along the way, feel free to do so. So as a starting point, I used to be a young and innocent professor of software engineering in the 90s and in the early 2000s in Sweden and also in the Netherlands. I'm originally Dutch, for those of you that don't know me. And then in the early 2000s, I got a call from Nokia. So I worked for Nokia until the iPhone was announced. Then I decided to leave. I wish I could claim causation, but there is just correlation, unfortunately. I had the opportunity to move to Silicon Valley and work for a great company, Intuit. I really, really enjoyed my time there. But after a number of years in the US, for family reasons, we decided to move back to Sweden. And these days, in addition to running a small consultancy and in being involved in a number of startups, I run something called Software Center. Software Center is today 11 companies and 5 universities, and our goal is to improve the digitalization capability of the European software-intensive systems industry. And if you feel that this is a good thing for you and you're not yet on this list, then come and talk to me afterwards, because of course we're still looking to grow this network. But we have companies like Tetra Pak and Saab, Siemens and Bosch, Qualcomm, a local SME, Access Communications, a web security camera company, now part of Canon. the two Volvos, Volvo Cars and Volvo Trucks. Jeppesen, part of Boeing, is in the software center. Ericsson, and then you can barely see it at the bottom. Oh, it's better over there. Grundfos is part of the software center as well. And then we have a number of universities. We look into a variety of topics. We look into anything from continuous integration, delivery and deployment to software architecture, metrics. We have great work ongoing there. Customer data and ecosystems. The theme leader for that is here in the room. Autonomous systems, Internet of Things, etc. We do not only work with companies that traditionally were metal bending companies. We also work with digitally born companies, companies like Booking, Spotify, Rovio, Klarna, King, and Microsoft. There we take some of the inspiration that we then try to bring to the embedded systems world. I sometimes get the question, Jan, why did you end up in Sweden? And for those of you that are not from Sweden, it's probably important to realize what a fantastic phenomenon this country is. We were only 10 million people, and yet we have the strongest industry base, perhaps almost of all of Europe. We have companies like the Volvos and the Ericssons, the Sony, it's now Sony Mobile, Saab, Defense, Electrolux, Volvo Cars, Sandvik, Scania, etc., etc. We have lots of companies. And not only that, we have a fantastic startup community here with real hits like Spotify that went public recently, King, Mojang, the company behind Minecraft, Klarna, we have several other players. And not only that, the Nordics are only 3% of the European population, but the Nordics generate 1/3 of the billion-dollar exits. And I think that that's quite an accomplishment. And if you look here at the whole scene here between Stockholm, Gothenburg, and the Malmö region, you see lots and lots and lots of other companies that are actually being surprisingly successful. It's a hotbed of innovation, this country, and I'm really proud to be allowed to work and live here. So trends in industry. So the first thing, if we look at the Gartner hype cycle, if you look at what is actually on that list, almost every item on that list is driven by software. If you look at Gerd Höfner's, one of my favorite futurologists' predictions, he looks on the left side at all the technologies that are happening, and then on the right side, he looks at all the scenarios that this enables in society. We again see that almost every of these technologies is driven by software. There are very interesting things. Automation of everything. We've always used software to support human beings doing their job better. We're now moving towards a world where humans are replaced completely. I'm not sure who of you are looking into self-driving cars or related technologies, but their whole purpose there is to get the drivers out of the driver's seat, which is a very good thing considering the number of deaths that happen in traffic, but it will also ensure that a lot of people are out of jobs. So that's an interesting one. Decentralization of everything is another interesting one. The previous speaker mentioned Bitcoin, and what I think is interesting is that we in several fields in society see a model where we move away from a single central trusted authority to a much more decentralized way of organizing things. If we look at companies like Google, they want to be the third half of your brain, and we can really see that happen, although I'm not quite ready to get myself implanted with that technology yet. Yeah, and then deep learning. I'm not sure who of you have been looking into AI and deep learning, but it's amazing what we can accomplish with deep learning these days. I'm on the board of a fabulous company in Stockholm called Peltarion that's building a platform around deep learning, and I've just been blown away time and again with what these technologies bring. But what is important here is every one of these technologies is driven by software. As Pekka mentioned in the introduction, software is eating the world. Yeah, the first thing that I do when I wake up in the morning, when I get out of bed, is I brush my teeth. How do I brush my teeth? I use an Oral-B electric toothbrush. 2 years ago, Oral-B announced a software ecosystem for toothbrushes. I'm not joking. How cool is that? It means that they put Bluetooth in the toothbrush, which talks to your mobile phone, and after you've brushed your teeth, you will get feedback on the quality of your toothbrushing experience. Pretty cool, huh? And then throughout the day, with everything that we're doing from to logistics or infrastructure, forestry, agriculture, sports, electricity generation, telecommunications, self-driving cars, banks, and even garbage collection these days is becoming software-driven. We met with a startup in Finland called Enevo, which puts ultrasound sensors, a big battery and a 2G connection in these big recyclable waste bins, and every hour or so they measure how full the waste bin is, and the company gets live data on how much waste is in the waste bins, which means that the company can then go and create dynamic garbage collection routes, which leads to a reduction of up to 50% in the garbage collection costs. So everything is driven by software. Self-driving cars, driven by software. Robots, driven by software. In defense, we're moving towards drones. Drones are driven by software. Even the most backward industry, construction, the only industry that has had, according to a recent Economist article, 0% productivity improvement since 1947. Now that's hard to not have any productivity improvement over such a long time. Even that industry is now dragged into the 21st century with 3D cement printing, automatic bricklaying, automatic road construction, etc., etc. Why is everything moving to software? I think it's important to reflect on that for a minute. And for this, I will use the cycle of innovation. You've all read the Lean Startup or related books. The cycle of innovation is a very simple one. You have an idea. Based on that idea, you build something that results in a product. You measure, once you have that product put out in the field, you measure that results in data. That data will give you learnings, and from these learnings, you will have new ideas. Now, the point is that companies are more innovative if they go faster through that innovation cycle. So if we take automotive as an example, a big industry here in Gothenburg, if you look at a car platform, a typical car platform lives around 10 to 15 years, which means that it goes through a build, measure, learn loop once every decade, decade and a half. Which means that you will maybe see 2 or 3 platforms in your entire professional life. If we look at car models, cars, we see the same thing. A car is around 3 years for the car companies that I work with. So that means I go through a build, measure, learn loop once every 3 years. But what about car software? Car software is deployed maybe every week or every day. And this is happening, and it's starting to happen even in software subject to functional safety standards. Yeah, but if I can push new software into cars every day or every week, I have an innovation cycle that is 100, 200, maybe even 500 times faster than any other technology. It gives me opportunities that are unfathomable with any other technology than software. That's what the power of software brings us. And we can see this because if we look at the size of software systems, the software systems go up with an order of magnitude in size every 5 to 10 years. And automotive, including the Linux and the Linux kernel, are actually leading the way here. A modern car, we had a keynote in one of the workshops here at ICSE yesterday. A modern car has now well over 100 million lines of code. More than 100 million lines of code in a car. Now, I'm not sure what kind of size of systems you're working with, but for me, 100 million lines of code is a lot of software. Yeah? And we can see this. This is a graph, and for the people from Volvo Cars that are here, I need the updated version of this. I've asked some of your colleagues. Yeah, but what we see is an explosion, an exponential development of the size of software that goes into systems. I don't think I'm surprising anyone with the amount of data. It's very hard to find accurate estimates. I found one which says that 50 terabytes of data is created every second. I think that's a gross underestimation. That maybe is the amount of data that gets stored every second, but it's most certainly there is a lot more generated every second. And if you look just at what happens in 1 minute on the internet, in terms of the number of emails that get sent, the number of hours of Netflix that was referred to. According to this graph, every minute, 266,000 hours of Netflix get watched around the world. That's a lot of Netflix. Yeah. If you look at messages, 187 emails, etc. All these things generate data. And this is just the data that gets generated by human beings. Now we're moving towards 50 billion connected devices that are generating even larger amounts of data. Yeah? The final trend before I go to the patterns around digitalization is around speed. I don't want to talk in great detail around this graph, but what we can see is that as time progresses, the willingness in society to adopt new technologies that add value to people's lives is accelerating rapidly. Yeah, from Quicken taking 6 years to reach 1 million, to Angry Birds hitting 50 million in about a month. And for those of you with kids, small or large, that have played Pokemon Go at any point, 2 summers ago we had a complete explosion of usage around that system, which I think was amazing. Now, if you don't like customers, but you like money, since I have a lot of industry people in the audience, here is a graph to think about. If I assume I'm selling a product at $1 billion a year, and I put my R&D budget as a percentage of revenue, and I put it for simplicity's sake, we have some issues with our math education here in Sweden. For simplicity's sake, I put it at 10%, which gives me a $100 million R&D budget. And if I assume that my new product development cycle is 12 months, then I'm going to give you 2 options. The first option is I'm going to focus everything I can on becoming more efficient. And I'm successful. I'm 10% more efficient. I still ship my product after a year, but I've only spent $90 million instead of $100 million. That's pretty cool, right? But here's your second alternative. I'm going to focus all my energy on becoming faster, on shortening my development cycle. And assuming that I'm 10% faster and I'm selling at a flat rate of $1 billion a year, I'm not cannibalizing any existing business, I'm generating $100 million of additional top-line revenue to the company just by being able to put a product in market faster. Look at this. I have just earned back my entire R&D budget just by being faster. How cool is that? Yes? And the other thing is, for those of you that work at large companies, companies that focus on efficiency have a tendency to put all kinds of boards, milestone reviews, and other things in place in order to make sure that nothing inefficient will ever happen in this company. By extension, nothing at all happens in companies. Everything gets slowed down. If you focus on efficiency, you get slowness as a byproduct. If you focus on speed, you will actually get efficiency as a byproduct, because you're going to look for everything that you can either automate, do differently, take off the critical path or whatever. And this is, I think, a key takeaway. And people that have seen me present before know that I talk a lot about speed. Speed is so important because it has humongous business benefits. Where I want to spend a little bit of time on, and this talk was actually, you know, I run Software Center. Why I run Software Center I didn't talk about, but the reason that I run Software Center is because I am really concerned about the European software-intensive systems industry, and I want to do my bit to help companies change faster. And as I mentioned, I work with dozens of companies, and I've been trying to identify why I wrote this blog post and have this title on why digitalization will kill your company too. And the reason is that I saw at least 5 recurring patterns that I identified at multiple companies that just happened all the time, which I think are generic. The first is a severe lack of software expertise among senior managers and key decision makers. Most people that are high up in the Christmas tree of companies have an atoms background. They either have a mechanical engineering background or an electrical engineering background, and they just don't understand the digital world. And that causes them to fail to recognize opportunities until it is obvious for everyone. And by the time that it's obvious for everyone, all the opportunities that could have been created have already been capitalized upon by other companies. So that's the first thing, no software expertise. The second is lack of ambidexterity. Every time I walk into a company and a discussion comes up between investing some resources that give immediate return on investment, but it's a very low return on investment, or a chance at a very high return on investment at some point in the future, companies always pick the short-term, low-risk option. And that means that companies, because every company who's competitive is resource constrained, don't put resources into creating a future for themselves. They invest all their resources on the short term. And that, I think, is a very serious problem. Especially since I meet a lot of people outside R&D and especially outside software R&D as well, is that many senior leaders view digitalization as a technology problem that the propeller heads in software have to fix for the company. And they don't understand that it is actually something that affects all functions in the company, and it needs to really be addressed in a coordinated fashion, and the C-suite has to be involved in those kind of activities. The fourth challenge that I see in a lot of companies is that they say, yeah, you know, I know digitalization is interesting, but my customers are not asking for it. Yeah, but the challenge is that if you go and wait until your most valuable companies ask for digitalized solutions, you are just going to be disrupted together. Yeah, you and your customer will both be disrupted at the same time. That is one of the risks that we run into. And then the other challenge that I saw with a few companies is, by the time your customer is ready and says, okay, now I want a digitalized solution, how long does it take you to get one? Yeah, you have to start well before your customers are actually asking for it. And then the final one, overly zealous internal functions. What do I mean with it? All kinds of companies have safety functions, chief data officer functions, and other functions in the company that interpret standards and regulations much more strict than what the regulations and standards actually say themselves. I work with one company that is really worried about GDPR and other things, so they have put in place, and this is a very large company, they've put in place chief data officers, people that have to make sure that the company collects data in a legal way. Whenever anyone goes to any chief data officer and asks, we would like to collect this data for a variety of purposes, the standard answer is no. Yeah, and if you do that, then of course you run into a situation where you can never innovate. You're always too late and you're actually unable to innovate. There are lots of other examples as well. For those of you that are in safety standards, many companies that work with ISO 26262 interpret the standard as if it requires a waterfall and slow release process, which is actually not the case at all. Yeah, but what we see is that internal functions in the company are more Roman than the Pope, as we say in Dutch, and they are overly rigid in their interpretation of what is actually required. So those are the 5 reasons that I worry that many of the companies that I work with are going to be disrupted by companies that actually understand what is going on here. I want to move to this last part of my presentation, which is also the longest part, I'm afraid, which is this new digital business operating system. And for this, I will introduce an extremely simple model. As I often say, I'm not very smart, so I can only do simple models. And this model is called the 3-layer product model. And what it says is that any system, any product, any portfolio, any platform is organized into 3 layers of functionality. There's a layer of commodity functionality, stuff that you need for your product to work, but no customer is going to pick that functionality over one of your competitors. Or it's going to pick you over one of your competitors because of that functionality, the commodity stuff. When you picked your new mobile phone, the fact that you could make phone calls with that phone did not factor into your buying decision. You would have been really annoyed if you couldn't make phone calls with your new mobile phone, but you don't pick your mobile phone because you can make calls with it. That's assumed. It's called table stakes. It's just commodity stuff. On top of that sits a layer of differentiating functionality. That's the stuff that makes customers pick you over one of your competitors. That's the thing that makes people say, we're going to go with you instead of your competitor because you can do these things that others cannot. That's the differentiating stuff. On top of that, there's an innovation and experimentation layer. That's where you innovate and try out new things in order to identify future differentiation. And what typically happens is that I try out, say, 10 things in my innovation and experimentation processes. The average success rate for many companies is around 10% around innovation, so I will have one of those be successful. I productize it and put it into my differentiating functionality layer. Customers are really happy with it. They want to see it, etc., etc. And then over time, competitors catch up. My customers are less interested in the functionality. It's not as differentiating anymore. And then it sinks into the morass of commodity functionality. You still need it, but it's no longer differentiating. And the questions that companies ask, if you ask me, and in my experience, is a number of ones. If you look again at the three-layer product model and the innovation, differentiation, and commodity and the transitions, the first is, how do I expand my innovation funnel? Well, for this, I work with my ecosystem, my innovation ecosystem. I collaborate with others in order to identify new innovations that typically are at the fringes or even outside my areas of competence. Then I ask myself, once I find something interesting, how do I get it to market faster? And for this, I focus on speed. We're going to come back to that. How do I know that what I'm building is actually adding value to customers? Because you cannot ask them. You have to measure their behavior. You cannot ask them what they actually say. And for this, I need data. Well, how do I identify that some functionality that has been differentiating earlier is now starting to commoditize? Well, again, I use data for this. And then how do I minimize the total cost of ownership for commodity functionality? Here I partner with my ecosystem. And then finally, how do I organize for all of this? Here, empowerment is becoming critically important. Yeah, we're moving from a world where we organize in hierarchical organizations, organized in functions, to cross-functional teams that are fully empowered. Hierarchies are a way of the past, and if you are still organized hierarchically, you're risking going the way of the dinosaurs. We're going to come back to that. So this leads to a new business operating system. The first is, speed is important for business agility. We do not care about agile software development for its own sake. We care about agile software development because it is a critical enabler for business agility. As a business, we want to be able to rapidly respond to new opportunities, avoid risks, stop doing things that are actually not adding value to customers in a much more rapid fashion than what we've done in the past. We collect data by instrumenting and measuring so we can take data-driven decisions. We work with ecosystems so we can focus ourselves, our own resources on what is differentiating, and we focus on empowerment because that's the way in which we can organize organizations that work in a way that we need to have in this modern future, or in this modern way of working. I've developed a model called the Stairway to Heaven in the context of Software Center. It has these 4 dimensions. The first dimension is speed, and what you'll see is the typical evolution path that companies move through. So they start with traditional development, and then at some point they move towards agile, which is actually, even though many companies complain about it, it's actually a relatively simple change. No responses, but that's how it is, because it only involves the R&D function itself. Then, once you have Agile in place, you tend to move towards continuous integration, because all those Agile teams that are working in sprints want to know if their stuff is actually working or not. Once you are at continuous integration and you're good at that, you tend to move towards continuous deployment, and this is really happening. Ericsson went out last year with a big ad in the newspapers explaining to their customers that they can now get new software in live base stations every 2 weeks if they want to. Yeah, so Ericsson now does continuous deployment for the customers that want it at least every 2 weeks. Last week, I was at a wind turbine company in Denmark. I will not mention it because there are at least 2 in that country. Yeah, and they told me that they put new software in wind turbines every 4 weeks. Every 4 weeks, there is new software pushed to wind turbines. And we see this happening in industry after industry. This is not just something that the Netflixes and Amazons and Googles of this world do. This is now also becoming a reality in the embedded systems world. And actually, customers are expecting it. And then finally, you can move to what I call R&D as an innovation system, when you can actually start to test the value of features out in the field by pushing version A of a feature to say 5,000 cars or 5,000 wind turbines, and pushing version B of the same feature to 5,000 other cars or 5,000 other wind turbines, and then you start to measure which of these is performing closer to what you consider to be the better way. And then after some while, when you have the data, you can decide to go either with A or with B. I mean, online companies now run A/B experiments by the thousands. We do some work with Booking and Microsoft, and those companies run A/B experiments, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 A/B experiments concurrently at any point in time in their organization. The former CTO of Booking told me that they did around more than 30,000 A/B tests during 2016. That's the scale that online companies do these kind of things with, and embedded is rapidly following in the same path. Why do we care about this? Again, I have to speed up a little bit because I have too much material, but we have 6 development cycles that we care about. The development cycle, the requirement cycle, the quality assurance cycle, the governance cycle, the deployment cycle, and the value creation cycle. And if you map that to the speed dimension of the Stairway to Heaven, then what you'll see is that every time you go up one step, 1 or 2 of those cycles go from being long, slow, and opinion-driven to being fast, sprint-based, and data-driven. And I think that that is important to realize, because even for those of you that have continuous integration in place, this is only internal quality assurance. You will not know for sure that in all configurations that all your customers have out there, this will actually work. For that, you need continuous deployment. And then finally, even if you do continuous deployment, if you're not actually measuring if your changes in your software are creating the measured effects or the effects that you were looking for, you don't know if you are actually delivering value for customers or just nuisance. Yeah, and that's, as I think, an important one as well. And remember, if you have slow cycles, people take opinion-based decisions. And if you are in an industry that is under rapid change, you tend to base your opinion-based decisions on experience that you've collected over the last years or decades. And the problem is that when an industry changes very, very rapidly, experience is actually a liability and not a competitive advantage. Yeah, you tend to take the wrong decisions because you base yourself on things that used to be true in the past but are not true anymore. And that's a hard reality that many people that are starting to develop gray hairs like myself have to live with. We do work on architecture technical debt. If you're interested, come and talk to me or Antonio. I'm not sure if Antonio's in the room here, but he has done great work there. We do work on continuous integration and how to visualize all the testing activities. I don't have time to talk about that either. I see that many companies are moving. Some of you may know that I had a background in software product lines and platforms. Are moving to a continuous delivery model. And for that, we need to move away from having customer projects, and we need to automatically derive all our software from a single code base. If that is interesting, then come and talk to me. But that's the first dimension of the Stairway to Heaven. The second stairway is the data dimension. Yeah, and here we see that companies go from working with data in an ad hoc fashion to working with automated collection, but then analysis, reporting, and decision making is still manual, to then automation, which is when you get those big dashboards. The problem with dashboards is that they tend to be very static, so they don't change very rapidly. Then we move to data innovation, where we have a constant flow of new data insights being identified by data scientists that make it on dashboards, so the dashboards become live entities that are constantly evolving. And then finally you move to the evidence-based organization, where everything in the company is driven by data. Yeah? So I don't have too much time to go into this, but I wanted to stress this is a highly controversial study done more than a decade ago by Standish Group, but our experience actually backs this up. It says that in a typical system, somewhere between half and 2/3 of the features in a typical system are never used or used so seldomly that the R&D investment in those features was actually not justified. We did our own study with a few master students and a few people at Chalmers a few years ago, and we saw exactly the same pattern. Some features are used a lot, some features are used occasionally, and many features are never used. Now, we've done a lot of work in this area, but one of the models that I think illustrates how we're thinking about this the best is the HyPEX model. which basically says we have a feature backlog, we pick a feature out of the feature backlog, and before we go and work on this feature, we first sit down with product management to determine what is the measurable behavior in a customer or in the system that this feature will create before we actually start development. So we go for the expected behavior. We tried this with a company here in Gothenburg. We've tried it with several companies, but this was a particularly illustrative one. We had 10 product managers in the room. There were 3 product managers actively advocating the feature that we were discussing. And when we asked them what would be the measurable effect, out of 3 product managers, I get 4 different answers. Yeah, no alignment, no agreement on what is actually happening at all. Then you build the minimal viable feature, which is the first 10, 15% in the feature that you think will give you the most value. And you deploy it and you start to collect data. And for those of you in the startup scene, I apologize. This still says minimal viable feature, but it should of course have become, because the terminology has changed, the minimal lovable feature. Yeah, I think you all now know that we've moved from minimal viable products to minimal lovable products. But I have the minimal lovable feature out there, the first 10, 15, 20% of the feature. I deploy it and then I measure how it actually performs in practice. And then I get data back. And sometimes, you know, I'm lucky. I built 25% of the feature. I get everything I want. I'm done. It may also be, I built the slice of the feature. I see no effect whatsoever. And you know what you should do then? Abandon the darn feature. Why build something that doesn't have any impact? Yeah, the other is that, you know, I see some movement, but not enough. So I built the next 10, 15% and I deploy that. And even, and this is a typical outcome, I look at the data and I understand that the feature customers want it, but the way I'm building it is just completely wrong. I have to build it in a different way. And then you basically replace it. This is the Hypex model. If you want to know more, come and talk to me afterwards. Ecosystems. We have a similar stairway for ecosystems. I don't want to talk about it in detail. What I want to talk about is the 3-layer product model. You all remember this model that I introduced in the beginning? I've now asked well over 50 companies what percentage of your R&D effort is spent in the commodity layer and what percentage of your R&D efforts in your company are spent on differentiation, innovation, and experimentation. You know what the answer is? In a typical company, 80 to 90% of all resources are spent on commodity functionality. Yeah, so look in the row where you're sitting to your left and right. You're the only one who's working on differentiating functionality. Everyone else is working on commodity. Does that make you feel any better? Not really, eh? No. But this, my friends, is the state of software engineering today. 80 to 90%, 8 or 9 out of every 10 people in R&D these days are working on commodity stuff, stuff that no customer cares about. It should just work. And the 1 or 2 that are actually working on new stuff get it wrong half the time. That is the state of software engineering today. 50 years in, yeah, software engineering is as old as I am. I know I look much older, but you know, that's it. Yeah, so, but 50 years in, that is the state of software engineering. I cannot help but think that there is some slight room for improvement here. We need another 50 years, I think, to solve that. Now, how do we address that? Well, we've developed something called the 3-layer ecosystem strategy model that I can talk about, but I will not. But what we've basically done is we have identified with the software center companies what are the strategies that they use around innovation, around differentiation, and around commodity. And what we see is that many companies are actually deploying strategies to free up resources in the commodity layer. Ericsson, for instance, very often does rationalized insourcing, meaning they push off platforms that are commoditizing to low-wage countries in Asia or in the eastern parts of Europe. A company like Volvo, together with BMW and a few others, created an open source initiative called Genevi, where they jointly created a Linux-based platform for infotainment systems, because we all need a platform. That was basically the thinking. We can build our own differentiation on top of it. So that's one strategy. Axis Communication always works very closely with the Linux community, and whenever some of their video processing functionality starts to commoditize, What they do is they work with the Linux community to have the Linux community adopted into the main branch or the mainstream of Linux, because the moment it's in there, the Linux community has early access to pretty advanced video processing functionality, and ICSE gets its software maintained for free because it just comes with the Linux distribution. So there are many ways in which you can actually free this up, but most companies get stuck in more and more commodity. I want to spend my last minutes on the organizational bit and empowerment. This is one slide from Gaping Void that I actually like. In most hierarchical organizations, the losers are at the bottom, the clueless are in the middle, and the sociopaths are at the top. And I know that many of you are managers, so I hope that this makes you feel better. Yeah, so if we talk about empowered organizations, we have a similar stairway, which I will not go into, but we move from traditional to agile to cross-functional to self-managed to fully empowered. But why do I care so much about it? I care about this because hierarchical organizations have been the way of organizing in the 20th century, but I don't think it's the way of organizing in the 21st century. Why? Because what makes hierarchical organizations strong, which is things like effective scaling, controlling many people from a central position, repeatable tasks, harmonization of processes, globalization, handling low complexity situations. Well, all those things are no longer true in the reality in a digitalized world. So what does this mean? Many hierarchical organizations have slow decision making. Yeah, they have power that is driven by position, not by capability. Many organizations are not meritocratic. Tendency to be internally focused. Yeah, I worked with one company in Germany that shall remain unnamed, where one manager had the choice to do something that was good for the company and neutral for his competitor, or to do something that was bad for the company but also bad for his competitor. Guess what he chose? The second thing, because we are internally focused. Yeah, easily gravitates to politics. Not in Sweden. In Sweden we don't have politics, but in other countries that can happen. That was intended as a joke for those of you that missed it. Highly resistant to changes and really challenged by high complexity situations, which is what digitalization is all about. And we can see this. This is employee engagement in the US, 2013, 2014. On average, 30% of employees is engaged in their job. Around 50% is not engaged in their job. Around 18% of people is actively disengaged in their job. You know what it means? It means that they will try to harm the company if they can get away with it. They will try to break the printer if no one is watching. The truck driver will try to dump boxes in the back of the truck as hard as he can in order, or she can, in order to hopefully break stuff. Yeah, that's what that means. And now for all the Europeans in this room, you may think, yeah, but Jan, this is the US, Sweden, this must be much better, right? The mecca of the socialist society, if you want. Yeah, in Sweden, 16% of people is engaged in their job. 73% of people is not engaged in their job, and 11%, only 11% is actively disengaged. And if you look at the younger generations, you can actually see that the younger you are, yeah, like millennials, like my kids, the less engaged you are in a traditional hierarchical organization. And this is costing companies vast amounts of money. And there is an alternative now developing. There is an alternative way of organizing around self-management, which means that there are no bosses in those organizations. Around wholeness, you remember IBM from the early 90s, where everyone was wearing the blue suit and the gray tie, or the other way around, and the white shirt, of course, below it, where you had to look like cookie-cutter examples of the standard IBM employee. Well, these companies are very much focused on wholeness and on evolutionary purpose. They use mechanisms like roles and activities and the advice process, which is a very interesting one, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's not consensus. That's a very important one. Agreements and constant evolution. And there are several examples. Agile is already the first example, the first step on this ladder. There's a book called Reinventing Organizations that introduces the concept of holistic or authentic organizations, which the author presents as the natural evolution after tribal, agrarian, scientific, industrial, postmodern, information-based to holistic, authentic organizations. Holacracy, a book that has received an approach that has received quite a bit of attention in the US, because Zappos actually reorganized itself using holacracy, is another example. And then there is a book called Exponential Organizations that explains how companies like Uber and Airbnb are able to do this. And again, also these companies focus a lot on autonomy, on dashboards, on experimentation, and on interfaces inside the company. And then outside the company, they focus on other things. So what we're moving towards is a way of organizing where it's principles. What are the principles we operate by instead of orders? Personal leadership over leader-follower. Trust over audits. The moment you audit, you're implicitly sending the message that you don't trust the people that did the job. This is one of the most underestimated psychological effects that you can see. Customer first over organizational structure first. Team-appointed managers over manager-appointed teams. There can be managers, but they have to be selected by the teams. Diversity over homogeneity. Agility over long-term planning. And emergent strategy over top-down strategy. With that, my friends, I've come to the conclusion. I have a few slides here. The first thing that I wanted to remind everyone of, no matter what business you're in the future, according to George Colony, all companies will be software companies. It doesn't matter if you build trains or telecom networks or cars, you are a software company. Yeah, tomorrow, Jet Anderson from Volvo Cars will give a keynote in the SEIP track titled, "The car is a computer on wheels." Yeah, and we're moving towards that. When we talk about the challenges that I described earlier, I thought I would at least capture what I think are the key things that you need to do. For no software expertise, that just has to be fixed. You have to get software expertise at the board level and in senior leaders in the C-suite. Lack of ambidexterity. There are systems that you can and should put in place to make sure that your resource allocation also protects the future. McKinsey has the 3 Horizons model. There are several other models that I work with in order to accomplish this. Yeah, digitalization needs to be owned in the C-suite. It cannot just be owned by the propeller heads in corners of the company. My customers are not asking for it. Maybe not, but that's probably because you're talking to the wrong customers. You want to work with the customers that are at the fringes or perhaps not even are your customers today. Those are the customers that you start to work on digitalized solutions on. And then from the overly zealous internal functions, they need to become part of cross-functional teams, and they need to become part of the solution rather than part of just creating problems. Yeah, they need to own and understand what they need to engage in order to deliver on such that the company can innovate while abiding by laws and regulations and standards. Conclusion, 3 key takeaways that I started with. Companies are increasingly disrupted and digitalization is the root cause. The pathology of change resistance in companies shows a number of recurring patterns. I showed you 5. And then finally, we need to move from a traditional hierarchy-based, atoms-based way of running companies to a digital business operating system which has speed, data, ecosystems, and empowerment as their key mechanisms. A few little marketing messages. If you like this stuff, in my consulting business, I've developed a assessment survey where companies can get feedback on how they're doing. And you know, here at ICSE, we're actually offering that for free. Free as in beer. Yeah, so if you are interested in that, come and talk to me afterwards. The other thing is I've written a number of books around this. The first one, Speed Data Ecosystems, I cannot give to you. But if you drop me an email at jan@janbosch.com, I'm happy to send you the links to the other 2 books for free. Or you buy them on Amazon from $9.99, your choice. Yeah? And with that, my friends, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.